Hi, this is Scott Dunbier. I am the Special Projects Director for IDW Publishing, and I'm here talking with Berkeley Breathed, the creator of Bloom County. And when this goes live, it will be the 40th anniversary of Bloom County. Congratulations, Berkeley.
Thank you. Is it today?
No, it's tomorrow. Today is the 7th. We're recording on the 7th, but it'll go live on the 8th, which is...
Yeah. Wouldn't it be good if it was today and then we could all say it's the day that we'll live in infamy? That would be a Bloom County moment, wouldn't it? December 7th?
Well, you know, I did realize yesterday, besides December 8th being the debut of Bloom County, was also the day that John Lennon was killed. Yeah. And then I realized yesterday that the strip ended on August 6th, which is the day of Hiroshima. So you...
And one day away from the beginning of World War II. It's, yeah. I don't know how that fits in there, but I need some happier moments to be aligned with, I think.
All right. Well, what I want to talk about first is, before you did Bloom County, you did a strip called Academia Waltz, and that was in your college paper. And then, correct me if I'm wrong, but you self-published 2 paperback books, and didn't that finance your schooling?
Yes. The books were self-published, to everyone's surprise. It did basically support me my last year of college and right up to syndication, which that punchline is that I've never actually worked a day of my life. I haven't received a paycheck ever, short of the proceeds of a very small book that we did in college, and then went right to work for the Washington Post. So, but in the interim, I did get thrown out of, the only job I ever had was of a political cartoonist for the Austin American Statesman, the regular paper in town. And that lasted 3 weeks until they threw me out, literally pushed me out the door and told me not to come back after I drew an offensive strip. So that was 3 weeks. I was a wage earner. That was it in my entire life.
But with that move, history was changed. So thank you.
Yeah, the editor of the Austin American Statesman, I don't think ever recovered from the thing that I had caused the problem of, but I kept going. So funny how fate handles things.
You mentioned the Washington Post. So how did you get the attention of the Post? Did they see the paperbacks you self-published, or did you did something to them?
I had made a cursory attempt at syndication by contacting the 3 major syndicates that I was aware of, and basically received rejection slips from all 3 of those. And I continued working and doing another year of work at the Daily Texan, and pretended to take another year of college to do so, and pretty much had given up any notion of being a cartoonist at that point. And what I was to find out later that happened was that a woman who worked at the Post elsewhere in the company had a son that was at the University of Texas that was sending her cartoons from my work, and she saw them and walked them upstairs to the syndicate and dropped them on the desk of the fellow that ended up being my editor for 10 years. And he saw them and gave me a call, and that was it. So I had almost absolutely nothing to do with the fact that I ended up syndicated. I had been turned down by the major syndicates, including Dewsbury Syndicate and Peanuts Syndicate, Charles Schultz's. So, and I thought that was all there was. I had no idea there were smaller ones, like the Washington Post.
That's a great story. So 40 years ago today, when this goes live, was the first Bloom County strip. Now, it's interesting because the first strip actually doesn't have any of the core characters in it. And then over time, some of the characters that you used in Academia Waltz came back and joined the cast of Bloom County. But about 6 months after the strip debuted was the first strip with Opus. And I've heard you, and I'm paraphrasing here, call Opus the emotional center of the strip. Um, how did you come up with Opus? Do you have any recollection? I mean, I know it's a long time ago, but what was the thought behind that?
I remember exactly. I don't remember much. Everything is a fog, but I do remember that for some reason. Maybe because it was asked so many times, it somehow stuck in my memory. Um, the operative point is that maybe the first time in the history of comic strips, a syndication contract was sent to someone who had not a faintest idea of what to draw for a comic strip. So the contract came, and for the title of the strip, subject of it, and the characters, I left TBD, to be determined. I had no idea. They were very clear they did not want a college comic strip, so I couldn't do the only thing I'd ever done, which is 2 years of college caricatures of college stereotypes. They knew they didn't want that. Anything else, they said, just give us whatever. So that was a problem for a writer. That was no structure at all. I had no idea. So the only thing left for me to do was to name the strip a place and hope that I figure out later who I should put there and what the strip is about. So I fell back on a cheat, really, is just naming it a locality and hoping that I would somehow, there'd be an inspiration at some point and I would know what to populate this place with. That was a good signifier as how the rest of my career would go, because it was all seat of the pants. So for 6 months, I didn't know. I was trying out characters. I had a couple of little boys. I had adults. I had old people. I had my grandfather. I probably had my sister. What I didn't have, as you mentioned, was an emotional center point, a focal point, a fulcrum to the strip that all comic strips need. And I would argue the ones that didn't live on as long as they should were missing that. Even Doonesbury, I would say, was a hard strip to find. Where was the center of gravity in the strip? Where was the point of view that everything else revolved around? He never really had it. It was always an ensemble, which whether you're doing a television show or a series of novels, it's a tough thing to keep going. Peanuts probably, they had two. He started out with Charlie Brown, and eventually it almost became Snoopy. One way or the other, there was always kind of he had tremendously strong characters, but kind of when people think of that strip, they think of one or two characters. And I was lacking that, and I knew I needed it. I had not a faintest idea who it should be. And I remember thinking, I'm tired of drawing people. I'm tired of drawing, and I have vertical boxes that need to be filled with someone standing. Even if I was drawing Peanuts and I wanted to draw Snoopy, he would not have fit in the boxes that I had already established. He's walking along the bottom of the page. Yeah, he actually walked on all fours in those times. So I wanted a character that was standing. I wanted a non-human. Penguin just sort of came to mind. Was already kind of dressed. They kind of born with a countenance of a character that's always about to say something nice and innocent. I didn't know what its name was. And I think I probably sketched it at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning in Iowa City, only a few hours away from my deadline, and I was desperate for something. And KRNA, a rock station in Iowa City, Iowa, the only one, who I listened to all night long while I was drawing, played a song from Kansas called Magnum Opus, Kansas, the rock group. And it came on. The music didn't inspire me, but the minute the guy said Opus, I looked on the page and I'd drawn the first penguin. There it goes. And put it underneath, and it worked. Now, it could think of all the horrible names that I could have been inspired to name it. It would never have, it wouldn't have lived another couple of days. It needed the right name. Snoopy needed the right name. If Snoopy had been named Mortimer, it wouldn't have worked.
True.
So it's one of those rare times when the universe aligned creatively and delivered the right character at the right time with the right name. And names are really important for characters.
No, absolutely. So So that was in mid 1981 when Opus came into the strip. And pretty soon after that, I mean, the strip was starting to get picked up in more and more papers. When did you realize it became truly a monster hit? I mean, at one point you were in 1,200 papers, right? And and I'm curious, was it before Loose Tales came out, or was Loose Tales the thing that really pushed it over the top?
Well, Loose Tales, for people listening who might not be familiar with it, was the first little book collection, about this big. And that came out about a year after the strip began. So you're asking, when did anybody know? When did I know? I don't think that it became apparent until they wanted to do a little book, as all cartoon, most comic strips have something, some little book they do. And they sold the book to a publisher, and the rights were for $10,000. And the first printing was for $10,000. I remember them calling me that. This is about a year into the strip, and telling me enthusiastically, we got a book deal, and they're going to print 10,000 books for the country. And I had sold 10,000 of my books in Austin, Texas, when I self-published, to a population of about 30,000 kids. So they had just told me, go celebrate, get your champagne. We're printing 10,000 books for the entire country of 200 million people. And when I didn't go, wow, what do we do with 10,000 books? They said I was chastised. I remember being chastised by my editor saying, BB, you really, don't get outside yourself. That's a big deal, is having a book published. And I go, okay, well, all right, good for that. And so they did. They printed it. It came out on a Monday, and it was actually sold out 2 weeks before it showed up. And what happens is it hit the New York Times bestseller list as a number one, and then it immediately dropped off because there were no books for 6 weeks. They had no books. They had no idea. I didn't have any idea. They suddenly booked me on the Today Show for an interview, and I didn't know how to do a television interview, and I didn't do one very well. But there were no books to sell. And this is you don't do this in book publishing. You don't get your author on a national television show and not have any books for 6 weeks, and that's what happened. So if you're asking when did it really occur to everybody, including me, and I had no ambitions with this. I just knew that I had 4 boxes to fill every day. I've been doing it in college. I might as well do it now. I had no idea. I had no knowledge of cartoons. I didn't know the business. I didn't know the industry, and I'd never wanted to be a cartoonist. And I was drawing, and now they were saying it's being well received. And it put everything in a different context. And it wasn't until I did a first book signing. And remember, I'm in Iowa City. I'm living in a basement of a tiny house in Iowa City, and my stuff's going out. There's no internet. There's no feedback. I'm not getting any indication that anyone's reading it at all. In those days, a creator was totally isolated. And when someone said, would you come out and do a book signing to Denver for your little miniature book? And then I show up, and I signed for 6 hours, and there were people acting ridiculous outside. I was 22 years old. So I had no idea what was going on. I was not a fanboy myself. I'd never been in a line for an autograph. I'd never read a comic strip. I never bought a comic book. And here all these people were trying to do something that I had never done, and wait in line for hours and all this. So it's a nice picture because the irony is built in. I wasn't prepared for it. I didn't understand it. I didn't have a good sense of all of it until I was out of the business 10 years later, really, and being able to look back and get a better perspective on how created characters work in people's imagination. I wasn't a fanboy. I wasn't a Star Wars fanboy. I love stuff behind the scenes. I love making things. I wasn't a consumer of pop culture that much. So I had no concept of following things with a passion. The only thing that I was passionate about was a couple of books and To Kill a Mockingbird, which of course explains much of the origins of Bloom County. Because if I had nowhere to go but imagine a milieu, an environment that looked like my favorite novel, which was To Kill a Mockingbird. And that's what I did. Bloom County was Macomb, Alabama. So that was as close to being a consumer of pop culture that I was, which did not put me in a very, very good position to understand how people were receiving my product. And it took a long time for me to get a perspective on it, to understand why these characters had such a role in people's lives, why either a movie character or a novel character or a comic character could play that role. So and I can't say it was fortunately, it was unfortunately, I probably could have used that point of view as I approached characters like Opus, which was wholly accidental and intuitive. There was no calculation, which actually may have suited me, that I wasn't trying to overcalculate it as a fan myself.
So, so I have a question for you. Going back to, you talked about how you weren't a fan of comic books, comic strips, anything like that. Why? Okay, I know that you're a huge fan of something like Phantom Tollbooth and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. But what's the jump to becoming a cartoonist when you're in college? I mean, it's sort of an unusual path because, like you said, you had no love for that kind of thing. What was it that triggered you to become a cartoonist then?
Yeah, because you're right. You're making a point that's a counterpoint to mine, which is I wasn't a fanboy. Why would I be drawing a comic strip? The story says everything about that ironic destiny for it. I was far more interested in being a photographer and getting into movies. But I discovered mass communication by my photographs being in even a college newspaper of 50,000 people, and waking up and seeing your product, my photography, in a newspaper disseminated to a large number of people. That hooked me. So mass communication did. I'd never identified being an artist, a physical artist or a cartoonist. I imagined being a writer possibly. But I worked in every area of a newspaper. Once I discovered that newspapers were the place to be, dissemination of one's thoughts, it was exciting, not necessarily drawing. But I got fired from being a photographer right away because I was making up the photos. I couldn't just take a picture of someone. I had to manipulate the photo before there was Photoshop. So I ultimately was fired from that. And I was fired from writing as I couldn't keep from making up stuff in journalism, which is not something that is appreciated in most journalism, is concocting bullshit. So they kind of said, why don't you try cartooning? Because we lost, all we have is Doonesbury, and we need a college comic strip that kind of looks like it. So I looked at Doonesbury and I thought I could probably draw as bad as that. And I put in my own, I put in the local characters from the Texas, which were very unique college characters. Of Steve Dallas was classic Dallas or Houston fraternity guy, and populated it with typical college humor of sex and the rest of it. And that became natural. So it combined my natural cynical point of view and my mocking everyone around me. I could draw a little bit, and discovered the power of what happens when you put your text, your words, which newspapers are filled with, right next to a drawn character saying them. Suddenly your audience is multiplied 100-fold. But I didn't know about that and discovered it, and it hooked like it was a red cape to a bull, So I started doing it because it was exciting and people were reading it, but not because, unlike Bill Watterson, I grew up loving the medium so much. So I fell into it accidentally. I backed into it and discovered myself in doing something that people enjoyed, my product, but I didn't particularly enjoy doing it at the time. It was just the best way to get a point across is throw a funny drawing of a face saying it rather than printing it on an article or a column.
And I think one of the things that really made the strip so special, when you started doing Bloom County, was that there was definitely cynicism there, but there was also a sense, there was a feeling it was naive in a way and very charming because of that. But getting back to after Loose Tales, then there was an avalanche of merchandising. I mean, everywhere you go, you would see Opus plush dolls. I mean, there was even an Opus.
Not like Garfield. Come on. I couldn't compete with some of the people doing it, but yeah, there was an exploration as to how it could be merchandised. And a few years later, when Bill Watterson got into the business, and as his legend, of course, is famous for, he wouldn't merchandise. Doonesbury would not merchandise. The only other comic I'd ever read in my life, besides Peanuts, which of course was the other side of that coin. But Doonesbury was what I cut my teeth on in college, so that was my template. And he refused to merchandise, not a T-shirt, nothing. And Bill Watterson shows up. He refused to merchandise, nothing. And I had to think long and hard. My fans wanted Opus on their desk. And my inclination, because I was following along on the kind of the heroes that I had around and the people that were around me, they were resisting it, and they seemed to feel that a physical Opus on someone's desk, on a fan's desk, is a subtraction from the original material. That somehow that is subtracting the value of the material it came from, the novel or the book or the movie or whatever. And I tried to fit my thinking into that and tell the fans, no, you don't get a T-shirt, you don't get a poster, you don't get Opus on your desk, you don't get Bill the Cat sitting on your desk. It's too good for your desk. I couldn't make that argument.
No, of course not.
And I wanted it on my desk. Maybe it came down to that. Is that I wanted to see my characters walk by. Yeah, there it is. So I was enough of a fanboy by accident that I couldn't give myself a good enough argument and I still don't understand that idea that you're taking your product so seriously that a physical manifestation of it that gives the readers and the fans a deeper appreciation of the character is somehow a diminishment of the written character. So yeah, it showed up and we had fun with it. And now we're doing it much more carefully and much better.
It's funny. You mentioned To Kill a Mockingbird and Harper Lee. Harper Lee was a fan of yours. She was a fan of Bloom County. And you've had other notable fans. I mean, we talked about Linda Ellerby and we talked about Ted Koppel. One of the ones, though, I find most interesting was Ronald Reagan. Now, I know you went to the White House. Was he actually a fan of the strip, or what was the story behind that?
I have a feeling he probably didn't know the strip very well. What provoked Reagan was a particular strip where I was inclined to often put famous people's faces in frames in the background of the strip, of the panels. And I found a picture of Nancy Reagan in her younger years, put it in the frame, behind characters that had nothing to do with Nancy Reagan, saying the joke had nothing to do with Reagan. But there she was in one panel, pretty picture of Nancy behind the characters. And he, whatever you say about Reagan, he was exactly as you saw and as you heard. He was in love with that woman in ways that all of us needs to be with our second wives. um, which is what his was, which is what Nancy was. And he responded to any image of her, and he probably wasn't used to seeing pretty pictures of her in cartoons. And he found this pretty picture on a Sunday, and the next Monday morning he found me and he called me up, and I was sure there was some agenda, and he just wanted to say, and if I could do Ronald Reagan's voice, I just wanted to let you know how thrilled I was seeing Nancy in the back of your cartoon.
Oh,
and I thought he was setting me up for a favor or the strip. And I said, well, do you want the strip? He says, oh, well, I didn't think you fellows let those out of your hands. and I went, there's a short list of the people we let them out of our hands for, Mr. President, and you were on that list somewhere. And he seemed very flattered. I mean, he's totally Reagan. And then I got an invitation to come to the White House for a state dinner shortly after that, after I sent it to him. And the coda to this story is that he and I I sat at his table, and he and I didn't talk about cartoons. But before we went in, or after dinner, we went to where traditionally everyone gets a cigar, but they have to let the women in at the blue room afterwards, after dinner. And they usher you over to he and Nancy. And Nancy turned to me and just wanted to talk about how she found all the cartoons too offensive for her these days. And of course, there was no more cartoon that was offensive to the Reagans than mine. So she wanted to make sure that I knew that she'd found my material far more vulgar than her husband did. So all I could do was heartily agree with her. So that was the last thing I had to say to her.
That's very funny. In 1989, when the strip was at really the height of its popularity, you did something unprecedented. You walked away from it. And 1 month later, you started Outland, which had many of the same characters, but was a completely different feel. It was also a different format. It wasn't constrained by Sunday strips. First of all, it was only a Sunday strip. There were no dailies. And also, a traditional Sunday strip is done in many different formats, in 2 tiers, 3 tiers. With Outland, you did something also very unusual. You basically made that strip only be viewable in one format, which must have been an incredible nightmare for newspapers. I mean, who cares? But you must have gotten a lot of kickback from that.
It limited a lot of papers' ability to cut them all up. But as I recall, Bill Watterson had actually done that before me, and he had gone through the pain of that pushback from newspapers of keeping an established format so they couldn't cut it up and put it in a vertical column. And that means that you could create much better art for the Sunday. But that wasn't the operative thing. It's the question from my fans was, why am I stopping Bloom County?
Right.
And that was hard to get across, but it cut to the very core of the problem in the beginning 10 years before, which was I had not set out ever to draw a comic strip. This was an accidental destiny that it was not part of the plan. Lucky for anybody to have that opportunity, but it did not come easy to me. The comics that I worked on years later, and in fact, the Bloom counties that I've done the last 5 years for Facebook, were done with the love of the medium that I did not have when I was 22 years old. I understand the art and the discipline and I needed the maturity that I didn't have as a very young man to approach a medium that I hadn't any particular intrinsic love for in the manner that it needed to. Hence, missed deadlines, storylines that went nowhere. I was unhappy with a lot of what I was drawing. I wasn't bringing to it the enthusiasm, the passion, and the joy, and the glee, and the rest of it that a comic strip should have at 24, 25 that it needed. And I knew that. And thus, I thought that I needed to find something that I could, and that was doing children's books and writing film ideas for movies, and then getting into film. That I knew that, I would bring a passion to, but I didn't think that I could carry on Bloom County, and I wouldn't have been able to longer than those 10 years.
Well, it's interesting because, then you did Outland, and that was for another 5 years or so. And then you took a break for a while and you did other things, like you said. And after 8 years, you came back with Opus, another Sunday only strip. But that also ended. You did that for another 5 years.
Each time I told the syndicate I would do something for 5 years and then quit.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a deal.
And it's interesting because then after Opus, you took another 8 years and you came back with the Facebook Bloom County strips. You're kind of like the cicada of cartoonists.
Yeah, it looks a little disjointed. What you're seeing there is somebody who loves the medium, but wants the pokers and 20 other fires at the same time.
Sure.
And Facebook, when I did in the last 5 years, allowed me that because it didn't have a daily deadline. I wasn't rushing down to the airport to ship everything off on a Friday morning at 4 o'clock in the morning anymore. So that allowed me the ability to draw when I wanted to. When I thought of something funny, I drew it and posted it. And you don't have that latitude with the Sunday. Well, certainly not with a newspaper, but there are no more newspapers to speak of now. And the comic page is not what it was. So I did do it and drop and do it and drop. And it wasn't because I was uncertain. It was I wanted to do it until it stopped being fun and go do something else and then go back to it when it was fun again.
And I think that shows in your work. I think you being able to go and do other things and then come back and be recharged. Your work, I think at each point your work is as solid and as good as ever. I mean, the Facebook strips are wonderful.
A good student of my work can see in the last 5 years of the Facebook strips an enthusiasm that I might not have had in 1987.
Oh yeah,
you can see it in the discipline of the writing, you could tell that I was having fun. Maybe that's it. You can see in some strips, especially the ones for every April Fool's Day, I would do a strip where I'd combine my work with Bill Watterson's,
sure,
as if we can join to do them together, which of course we did not. And if you can't see me having fun in those strips when you look at them now, and there's 5 of them now,
yeah,
you're missing it. And you could see any creator when they're having you can see the older Spielberg movies when he was just having a good time. You could tell his filmmaking was different. It happens with novelists. It happens with pundits and columnists when they're excited and when they're cooking. It reads between the lines. And the very first strip that I come back after 35 years, whatever it was, 25 years, when I drew the first Bloom County in 2015 or 16, that was as good a gag as I've ever had. And I couldn't wait to do it. And it was a delight to see if I could fill 4 boxes again. I hadn't done it in decades. You could tell I was suddenly having fun again.
Yeah. All right, let me ask you one last question.
Sure.
So what is next for you? What new horizons do you see?
Well, this is a talk about Bloom County, so I don't know so much about Bloom County. May have seen its day as far as newsprint, but I think there's reason to believe that you'll see it come to television, and potentially a film, especially if that happens. So if Bloom County's characters live on, it will be in other mediums, but hopefully the fans won't really detect any change of spirit or attitude, which I will be working to maintain and keep intact.
And hopefully, while you've slowed down on the news strips on Facebook this year, I personally, as a fan, hope that you do come back to it after your next, 4 or 5 year cycle and dive into it again.
Do it until I croak.
But Berkeley, thank you very much for taking the time to do this. happy anniversary. I could not be more happy that you are still doing Bloom County and that you created Bloom County. And that's it.
Well, and everyone should know that if it wasn't for you, my friend, there's a good chance I may not have ever come back to it in the last 5 years of Facebook. Your enthusiasm and your encouragement kind of led me there. So everyone's listening to this. Scott here is responsible for good or ill.
Well,
many ways.
We're much too kind, but thank you.
We're a good team.
Yes, we are. All right. Well, Berkeley, again, thank you very much.